And we're going to take you across the Capitol to the Senate Armed Services Subcommittee. They're just about to get underway looking at the Defense Department's ability to counter threats by weapons of mass destruction. Joni Ernst, the Iowa senator, is the chairwoman. She is in the room, so we'll take you live now to the Senate Subcommittee.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to call this subcommittee meeting on emerging threats and capabilities to order. And I'll start with an opening statement, and Senator Heinrich will have an opening statement from you, and then we'll move on to our witnesses. So thank you, gentlemen, for being here. The Subcommittee on Emerging Threats and Capabilities meets today to receive testimony on the Department of Defense efforts to counter weapons of mass destruction. We welcome Kenneth Rapuano, Assistant Secretary for Defense of Homeland Defense and Global Security. That's a very long title. You have long business cards, I'm sure. And Lieutenant General Joseph Osterman, Deputy Commander of United States Special Operations Command, SOCOM, and thank them for appearing before us today. This hearing comes at an important time. We are witnessing a troubling increase in the proliferation of WMDs by rogue states and terrorist organizations that pose a direct and growing threat to our national security. While we are familiar with and concerned by the growing size and capabilities of North Korea's nuclear program, we should also be mindful of its efforts to expand its chemical and biological weapons capabilities. The Washington Post reported in December that North Korea is moving steadily to acquire the essential machinery that could potentially be used for an advanced bioweapons program, from factories by the ton to laboratories specializing in genetic modification. Similarly, ISIS has demonstrated its ability to develop and use chemical weapons like chlorine and mustard warfare agents in Iraq and Syria. As fighters flee the region after the fall of the physical caliphate, we must be aware of the potential for their technical knowledge to spread. Additionally, there are new reports of Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad's continued use of chemical agents like sarin in attacks against his own people. All of these troubling developments vividly show the global nature of the WMD threat and, in turn, underscore the need for a global strategy to combat the threat. I note that the most recent DoD counter-WMD strategy was released in June of 2014. As I have just laid out, the scope and complexity of the problem has only increased since that time. This requires the DoD to reassess its strategy and ensure that we are postured appropriately in terms of organization, authorities, and capabilities to most effectively confront this threat, from preventing the development of new WMD threats and mitigating existing ones to responding in the event of a WMD incident. I look to our witnesses to provide the subcommittee with their candid assessment of how they view the WMD threat, as well as provide recommendations on any changes to our current approach that may be warranted. Additionally, while our preference will always be to deal with the threat before it reaches our shores, we must ensure that we are prepared to respond quickly and effectively to a WMD event in the homeland. I note that while DoD is not necessarily the lead organization for the Homeland Response Mission, it, in particular the National Guard, plays a key role in providing unique support to civil authorities like the Federal Emergency Management Agency, the Department of Homeland Security, and local authorities. We would appreciate an update on DoD planning and related efforts to fulfill its vital support mission in the event of a WMD attack on the homeland. Lastly, it has been over 1 year since the Unified Campaign Plan was updated to assign SOCOM with responsibility for synchronizing DoD's counter-WMD mission, which entails drafting a new global campaign plan, establishing intelligence priorities, and monitoring global counter-WMD operations. General Osterman, we look to you to provide an update on how SOCOM is managing its new responsibilities, the steps they have been taken to date, and a description of any issues that could challenge the ability of SOCOM to successfully execute this important mission. Thank you for being here with us this afternoon, and we look forward to your testimony on this important topic. I'll call on my ranking member to make his opening statement.
Let me begin. There we go. When all else fails, improvise. There we go. How's that? Let me start over. Let me begin by thanking Senator Ernst for holding this hearing on the Department of Defense's role in countering weapons of mass destruction. I certainly look forward to working with you again this year to examine key emerging threats and to craft the subcommittee's contribution to the fiscal year 2019 National Defense Authorization Act. The Department of Defense has a wide array of measures to control the spread of WMD, ranging from non-proliferation programs that help set international norms and export controls to other efforts that are designed to stop the development of WMDs by non-cooperative nations. Assistant Secretary Rapuano, your portfolio includes policy oversight responsibilities for these efforts, and I look forward to better understanding how they are achieving their objectives and also what challenges they may be encountering. U.S. Special Operations Commander SOCOM has played a key role in supporting DoD's role in countering the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction for more than 25 years now. As a force provider, SOCOM educates, trains, and equips special operators tasked with interdicting and rendering safe WMDs should they fall into the wrong hands. As a combatant command, SOCOM has also been tasked with synchronizing DoD's global plans and operations for countering WMDs. Today, I hope our witnesses will share their candid views on how SOCOM is fulfilling these critical responsibilities while also retaining its focus on countering violent extremist groups. As we all know, Special Operations Forces are a finite resource, and it is important that we maintain sufficient readiness to address any contingencies in these no-fail counter-WMD mission areas. I look forward to hearing your testimony, both of you.
Okay, we'll go ahead and start with our witness testimony. Secretary Rapuano, why don't we start with you, sir?
Thank you, Chairman Ernst, Ranking Member Heinrich, and members of the subcommittee. I'm pleased to be here today to testify about the Department of Defense's efforts to counter chemical, biological, radiological, and nuclear threats both at home and abroad. The United States faces a range of complex and multidimensional CBRN challenges. Over the past year, the North Korean regime has increased its dangerous and provocative behavior and continued to test nuclear weapons and ballistic missiles in clear violation of multiple United Nations Security Council resolutions. We've also seen the continued use of chemical weapons by both the Syrian regime and the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, further eroding the international norm against their use. More broadly, rapid technological advancements and increased access to dual-use technologies, expertise, and materials that can be used for both peaceful and military purposes heighten the risk that adversaries can more easily seek or acquire WMD. It has never been more difficult to prevent adversaries from acquiring the materials or expertise necessary to develop WMD or use CBRN materials in intentional attacks. Additionally, the speed, volume, and coverage of international travel means that naturally occurring pathogens of security concern can spread worldwide in days, potentially having the same catastrophic consequences of a deliberate biological attack. These diverse threats require multifaceted approaches that keep up with and adapt to the current threats while looking ahead to mitigate further risks. The intelligence community, Department of State, DHS, DOE, and the Department of Justice all play critical roles in detecting threats, preventing attacks on the homeland, and working with foreign partners to stop and respond to incidents. DoD supports these efforts through both domestic and overseas activities and works closely with allies and partners to counter the wide range of CBRN threats that exist today. Close cooperation with the other U.S. departments and agencies and allies and partners is crucial, since DoD must prioritize capabilities and efforts that counter operationally significant WMD risks and activities that are best executed by the department. We do this by ensuring we have a layered approach to detecting and mitigating CBRN threats at the source, preventing them from reaching the homeland, and when necessary, responding militarily. The Department's strategic approach to the CWMD mission focuses on 3 lines of effort: preventing acquisition of WMD, containing and reducing WMD threats, and when necessary, responding to and mitigating the consequences of their use. For example, to prevent the transfer of CBRN or dual-use materials to and from North Korea, the Department works closely with interagency partners to encourage states to impede and stop illicit shipments, including through efforts to build partner capacity and spread an understanding of international norms and obligations through the Proliferation Security Initiative. We also engage with partners through the DoD Cooperative Threat Reduction, or CTR program, to detect, secure, or eliminate CBRN materials and pathogens of security concern. Despite our best efforts at prevention, we must be prepared to contain and reduce CBRN threats once they have developed. DoD is postured to isolate, identify, neutralize, and dispose of CBRN threats before they can reach our borders. The Department also supports the government's efforts to deter adversaries and ensure that those actors that already possess WMD do not use them against the United States or our allies and partners. For example, DoD continues to support State Department-led efforts to work with international allies and partners to hold the Assad regime accountable for using chemical weapons. We remain concerned about reports of ongoing use and will continue to ensure the President has all the options available to respond as necessary. In addition, to contain and reduce the threat from ISIS, the U.S. and our coalition partners continue to exploit opportunities on the ground to better understand and disrupt their CW networks. Ultimately, though, should deterrence or efforts to contain and reduce threats fail, and an adversary attacks the United States or our allies, the Department of Defense's top military priority is to respond and prevent future attacks. This may require U.S. forces to operate in a contaminated environment, which makes it critical that we safeguard the force and ensure U.S. personnel can sustain effective operations in the event of war or other contingencies. This is why DoD works closely with allies and partners to ensure that we are prepared to respond to CBRN incidents overseas. In Asia, for example, DoD is working with key regional allies, the Republic of Korea and Japan, to ensure that our forces remain prepared to respond to CBRN contingencies on or emanating from the Korean Peninsula. Elsewhere, complementing those engagements, the CBRN Preparedness Program trains and equips partner nations to enhance their capabilities to respond to and mitigate the effects of a CBRN incident. In addition to being prepared to respond to events overseas, DoD must ensure we are ready to support the federal response to a domestic CBRN incident at home. While most incidents begin and end locally, significant events, such as a WMD attack, will likely require additional support from neighboring jurisdictions, state governments, and, as necessary, the federal government. DoD's role to assist the federal government's support of the state and local response when necessary is an important one. DoD has developed a wide range of domestic CBRN response elements and continuously trains and exercises to employ these capabilities, which can be used to support civil authorities to help save and sustain lives in the aftermath of a CBRN incident. While a large-scale nuclear, chemical, or biological attack is something we hope will never occur, we cannot be complacent or wait until a threat is imminent to act. As I said earlier, the complexity of this mission area requires a whole-of-government approach and strong unity of effort. I work closely with the Joint Staff and the combatant commanders and other DoD components to ensure the Department prioritizes its efforts and fully leverages DoD's unique authorities, resources, and capabilities to protect the nation. U.S. Special Operations Command, in its new role as coordinating authority for CWMD, has brought a renewed focus and sense of enthusiasm to this mission and is playing a critical role in ensuring that combatant commands are taking a trans-regional approach to countering these challenges and are developing the tactical capability, capacity, and plans to operationalize CWMD efforts. In closing, we must anticipate that our adversaries will continue to evolve and develop increasingly sophisticated methods to pursue, develop, or deploy CBRN weapons. The diversity of these challenges makes it imperative that DoD be rigorous in prioritizing its efforts and work closely with other U.S. departments and agencies and international partners to continue and to confront the threats posed by WMD at home and abroad. As CBRN-related challenges continue to emerge, your continued support for the Department and the efforts described today are critical to our ability to understand, anticipate, and mitigate these threats. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Secretary. General Osterman.
Chairwoman Ernst, Ranking Member Heinrich, distinguished members of the subcommittee, thanks for the opportunity to address you today. It is an honor to testify with Assistant Secretary of Defense Rapuano, whose office is critical in providing the policy and strategic guidance for the Department of Defense's support to countering weapons of mass destruction, or WMD. During his posture testimony to the full Senate Armed Services Committee last February, General Thomas outlined the U.S. Special Operations Command, or USSOCOM's, initial goals for our new role following the UCP change of January 2017. We're proud to report significant strides in increasing communication, information sharing, and operational coordination with other U.S. government agencies, as well as allies and partners who are working in this mission space. USSOCOM has decades of experience preparing and providing U.S. Special Operations Forces to execute counter-WMD tasks. The role of coordinating authority, as directed by the Unified Command Plan, broadens USSOCOM's scope of responsibility from traditional Special Operations Forces specific roles to the planning of Department of Defense counter-WMD efforts in support of other combatant commands, department priorities, and as directed, other U.S. government agencies. As in other mission areas in which coordinating authority has been established, this enables a more strategic approach and enhanced integration of Department of Defense plans and intelligence priorities. Since the transfer of defense lead responsibility for this mission set from U.S. Strategic Command and the establishment of U.S. SOCOM's Coordinating Authority, we focused on three major areas of effort. First, we're developing a functional campaign plan in coordination with the geographic combatant commands. The campaign plan takes a trans-regional perspective and emphasizes preventing new WMD development in existing programs and precluding aspiring actors from attaining a WMD. Second, we've conducted a baseline assessment to determine geographic combatant command counter-WMD capabilities and capacities. The assessment has identified shortfalls and will inform recommendations on future capability development and resource allocation. Third, we're increasing our understanding of the operating environment by enhancing integration of intelligence, planning, and assessments. To this end, we've established a counter-WMD fusion center dedicated to coordinating information flow and planning, fusing intelligence and operations, and providing the WMD community of action a single point of contact for DoD operational capability. While much progress has been made in the past year, a tremendous amount of work remains to finalize and fully implement these efforts. We look forward to continuing to collaborate closely with the Office of Secretary of Defense, the Joint Staff, Defense Threat Reduction Agency, other combatant commands, and the rest of the counter-WMD community. Thank you for the subcommittee's continued support to the counter-WMD mission, to our servicemen, and to our families. Thank you.
Outstanding. Thank you, gentlemen, very much. And we will open with questions, and we will do those in 5-minute iterations. And should we be joined by other members of the subcommittee, we'll allow their questions as well. I would like to start with you, Mr. Rapuano. Which WMD threat concerns you most at this stage, based on your work within the department and your insights across our interagencies?
Thank you, Senator. I think it depends on the filter that you look through, but if we're looking at the near term, clearly North Korea is a primary concern and focus of the department. A combination of destabilizing behaviors and very aggressive testing program for their ICBMs, aggressive statements about their nuclear weapons program and capabilities give cause for a great concern, and we've got a lot of efforts focused on that. I think that we are also put a lot of concern in terms of that evolving capability beyond the primary Russia-China focus, which you're well familiar with from the NPR and National Defense Strategy, is Iran, that they are developing missile and weapons capabilities in contravention of UN security resolutions and are a threat that we are monitoring closely and looking to address in a variety of ways. And then finally, in terms of developments that create growing concern over time is biotechnology. Just the rapid advances and ubiquitous availability of biotechnology today. Things that you can buy on the web now and essentially do a paint-by-numbers instruction were the province of Nobel Prize-winning scientists only decades ago. And that really levels the playing field for any actor looking to develop biotechnology, biological agents, and novelly engineered agents that could present a real threat.
Certainly, and thank you. You mentioned North Korea, of course, the nuclear tests, and we've all followed that with great interest. But something that we just don't talk about a lot, but was pointed out in the Washington Post, and I mentioned it in my remarks, is North Korea acquiring different mechanical pieces that potentially could allow them to develop chemical or biological weapons. Has that been a focus as well of the agency?
Yes. We and the rest of the interagency community have significant concerns about North Korean chemical and biological programs that we believed are focused on developing weapons. So we are tracking that very closely. There are a variety of export control, Australia Group, and other organizations for which we look to limit the export, the further proliferation of agents of particular concern. But we do have concerns about biotechnology and the ability to innovate agents and develop them without that kind of seed stock over the longer term.
Okay, and then in regards to the biological and chemical weapons as well, Secretary or General, when we talk about nation states, we know that they have the capabilities out there. What are the assessments when it comes to various terrorist organizations and or including ISIS? Do they have the ability to deliver those types of weapons?
So we understand that both Al-Qaeda and ISIS are interested in chemical, biological, nuclear. They certainly would be if they had opportunity to acquire the materials and know-how. More details in terms of understanding of those capabilities, we need to go to closed session, Senator.
Yes, absolutely.
And I'm sorry, General Osterman.
To add?
The only thing I'd like to add, Senator, is the fact that part of our functional campaign planning that we associate with this is to allow us, not only with state but non-state actors, to look at the threats, if you will, in vertical columns, and then this functional campaign plan cross-cuts those. So we can observe where the technology transfer may occur between state and non-state actors, also where one non-state actor perhaps is working with another non-state actor in a different geographic location or in a functional capacity. So we try to weave that in with the translation of our strategy and policy to actual tactical application of interdiction in order to basically reinforce the larger protocol efforts that are in place.
Okay, thank you very much. Senator Heinrich.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Secretary Rapuano, I want to go back to the issue you were talking about in terms of rapid innovation with respect to biological resources, and with technologies like CRISPR and others just changing that landscape at a rate that we could just has never occurred within the field before. Are there things that we should be thinking about now that can create some level of obstruction or raise barriers to entry to make sure that that we're doing an adequate job of what we apply with respect to export controls and other tools in other fields? How can we make sure that, you know, we're not just missing some very big developments that could be happening under our nose with off-the-shelf internet purchased items, for example?
So, Senator, that is something that we're very focused on with our interagency partners. There are a number of norms in terms of internationally, nationally, with regard to research being done in the bio area, where you look to not do certain things, but well-established norms that get at...
that works great for the folks who follow the norms. It's the...
That's exactly.
I'm wondering if we should have some sort of track and trace technology that makes sure that people are following the standards in the research community.
So there are efforts in that area. I didn't come prepared to speak in detail about them today. It's very difficult, though, because it's very widespread. The research is going on all over the world. It's not like more select research that's only being done in highly developed nations. It's proliferated to where it's being done places that would have been unimaginable decades ago.
Well, that wasn't the answer I was hoping for. I think we really need to put some thought into this, because this is a situation that feels like it could get ahead of all of us very quickly. I want to shift gears for a minute and ask you, General Osterman, with respect to special forces and how they have led the effort in places like Syria and Iraq in reining in development of chemical or biological weapons from groups like ISIS. You know, these are specialized missions. They're uniquely tailored for soft capabilities. But I wanted to ask, how would special forces perform this sort of a mission in a more conventional forces environment? Take a force environment like North Korea, where you have a very different battle space than you would in Iraq or Syria, a lot of very heavily secured WMD sites. I'm just trying to get without a specific locational answer, I want to understand how you apply that same mission set in a more traditional battle space environment.
Okay, Senator, I think I would probably answer that one from a standpoint of a reactive or proactive approach to it. Really, when you look at the proactive ways of being able to interdict things like that, it really is associated with a pathway approach. And I think you alluded to that in one of your opening statements about, components of different types of WMD that are required as precursors, or even technology requirements associated with, missile or other type activity. And so understanding pathways is important. And I guess when I would look at that from what we've done in Iraq and Syria versus what we've actually, would be looking at with a state actor, really the process is very similar. You look at that, for example, we could easily translate the human capital that is associated with the knowledge for these things, and that becomes an opportunity for targeting, whether it be kinetically or non-kinetically. So I think there's a lot of similar things that way that can be done. When it comes to secure facilities, all those, I'd probably have to get with you offline on that one, but as far as the details. But I would say that the approach is very, very similar in the sense that there's always human capital, resourcing, and technology that's associated with these type things, and just really depends on what scope it's actually being applied. But the fundamentals still apply. From example, as I mentioned with our fusion center, the ops intel fusion, to understand what is that indication of warning that things may be coming along, and how do you matrix that with the different threats that are out there versus viability of the threat? If that answers the question.
Thank you, General.
Sure.
Senator Shaheen.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you both for your testimony. I'm sorry I wasn't here to hear it, but can you, perhaps this is for you, Secretary Rapuano, how do we describe weapons of mass destruction?
Senator, that's a great question. In different quarters, it's described in very different ways. If you look at domestic law, the Department of Justice defines weapon of mass destruction essentially from a firecracker to a thermonuclear bomb. When we look at it in an international perspective, we have a much higher threshold. So it is a weapon that causes significant effects. But you still see a very wide range. Chlorine, for example, which is an industrial chemical, can be used and has been used, as we know, by the Syrians and ISIS as a chemical weapon. It doesn't have near the level of effect of nerve gas and other agents. So it's a pretty wide spectrum, but it's essentially a chemical, biological agent or nuclear device that creates significant consequence.
So do we consider cyber attacks as potential weapons of mass destruction?
So we have not defined to date in terms of how we in the U.S. government use the term WMD. We have not defined that to include cyber.
Should we? I noticed that the Nuclear Posture Review contemplated that there might be situations in which the massive use of cyber attacks could result in potentially a nuclear response. So should we be thinking about them in those terms, cyber attacks?
So Senator, my reading of the NPR, it doesn't define cyber use. It defines.
Boy, it leaves a pretty big hole there.
It defines the effects of any use of any technique that would be extreme and disastrous for the nation that could result in our response with nuclear weapons. So it's not the means, it's the end.
Right, but anything that might produce that sort of end has to be pretty disruptive. And so the question I'm raising is, should we be thinking about cyber in the same way that we're thinking about these other weapons of mass destruction? Because certainly they have the potential to create the same amount of chaos and potentially the same amount of fatalities, depending on how they're used. Senator,
I think the challenge with that is cyber is a domain from which there's zero negative effect all the way to could be very high potential effect. And with WMD classification, one of the distinctions has been the threshold of even lower use is significant enough to characterize it as a class of weapon.
Isn't part of the issue with cyber is that we don't really have a well-defined body of law and response proactively? Response is the wrong term. That we don't have a proactive way to address the potential of cyber attacks, and that's part of what makes it very difficult for us to figure out how to categorize those?
I believe the challenge with any means, whether it's cyber or other avenues of attack, is what is the threshold that will warrant what level of response? It's the threshold of the consequence that I believe is a deciding factor to determine what level and what significant the response would be.
I appreciate what you're saying. I don't think that really responds to the question that I'm raising, however. I want to go to another issue around cyber, though, because I appreciated the department's response to my inquiry regarding the work that the department does with IT companies and the issue around sharing sensitive source code data with Russia and other hostile governments. And I wonder if you can tell me why DOD doesn't require companies to disclose information about whether they have released their source code information to hostile governments and whether we should be doing that.
Senator, I don't come here to today's hearing with details on that, but I can get those answers for you.
I would appreciate that. Thank you.
Okay, we'll start our second round of questioning. Secretary, in the department's strategy for countering weapons of mass destruction, DOD states that it will dissuade pursuit and possession of WMD by demonstrating layered defenses based on active and passive capabilities. You had made those comments as well in your opening statement. Can you, in this open setting, can you describe what those capabilities are? What are those layered defenses?
So, Senator, that there's a range of defenses depending on the type of weapon used and the consequences of the effect. Starting with the passive, that's inclusive of resilience, to deny the adversary the intended benefit of the use. So the better defended or the more resilient the targets of their attacks, the less inclination on their part to employ it. Active military operations or a range of other activities that are not necessarily kinetic military operations. From a whole of government perspective, it's a well-known list, as you know: sanctions, there are diplomatic actions, there are financial penalties, and then getting into the military space, there's a full range of what the total force brings in terms of capabilities for response.
Okay, and as Secretary of Homeland Defense and Global Security, you coordinate the CWMD policy and oversee defense support to civilian authorities. And how is DOD postured to respond to a CBRN incident in the homeland? And can you give us an example and walk us through that?
Senator, we have what we call the CBRN Response Enterprise. It's almost 19,000, combination of National Guard and Title X military, who are formed into a variety of teams. We have the WMD CSTs, the civil support teams. We have the enhanced response teams. We have a range of teams with different mix of capabilities that go from decontamination, detection, medical effects, medical treatment. There is air transportation, ground transportation, the whole package that can be integrated, that can either be commanded by the state National Guards, and there's at least one team in every state, or they can be authorized under Title X and under DOD command.
I appreciate, and thank you for the shout out for our CSTs. I'm intimately familiar with the CST existing in our Iowa Army National Guard, Air Guard as well. We have both Air Guard and Army National Guard that combine their forces. It's a joint force. They work very proactively. But just for the public's information, can you describe their proactive stance and where they might be stationed during large events? Perhaps they were around the Super Bowl this past weekend, just so people understand how we utilize those teams.
Yes, as you imply, Senator, we use them on a routine basis, starting with national special security events, the Super Bowl, other large events, 4th of July. And these assets will be pre-deployed in the vicinity of activities for which there may be some concern that they would be the target of an attack that might include WMD. And they are prepared to respond in concert with all the other assets that are typically deployed for those events, law enforcement and others.
Mm-hmm. I appreciate that. And just to make it clear for our public that we are not just reactive in certain situations, but we're also very proactive in making sure that our public is safe here on the homeland.
Absolutely,
so thank you very much for that. We'll go on to Senator Sullivan, if you would like to take an opportunity to ask some questions.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And gentlemen, good to see you. General, Semper Fi. I don't know if the chair already asked it, so if she did, I apologize for the repetition, but how is the transition going from Stratcom, and are there assets that or authorities that you need right now from us that can help with this mission? I actually think from a broader national security mission, the counter WMD mission is kind of the evergreen mission. We might be going after ISIS for a couple more years or Al-Qaeda, but as long as we're a republic, the counter WMD mission is the evergreen mission. In my view, the most important mission in the U.S. military. And we want to make sure it's resourced, and actually think it made sense to transfer it over to SOCOM, but I'm sure the transition hasn't been flawless, and it's not like, General, you guys don't have other missions that you're currently focused on, so I'm wondering how it's going.
Senator, thanks for the question. Actually, the transition and assumption of the duties went exceptionally well. Very close and good relationship with U.S. Stratcom. It was well coordinated, well defined, and frankly, everyone came to the table with an understanding, a basic understanding of what the resource requirements were. And so, before assumption of the mission, we actually worked through all that. We're actually at a point right now where the way the plan was set up, and General Thomas approved essentially our transition plan, was that at the 1-year mark where we are right now, we would reevaluate kind of how things went over the last year. Do we have the right people in the right places and the right resources aligned to the mission set? And I think we're real close to what we need. We probably need to tweak it internally to optimize it, but everyone was very, very supportive that way. So right now, any additional resources we've put into the normal budgeting cycle, and I'm very confident they'll be represented in there. As far as the authorities, right now everything is moving along well. No problems with the geographic combatant commands, and helping to work with them, nor with the interagency.
Great.
Senator, if I could just add that SOCOM really, having been someone who's tilled in this field most of my career, that SOCOM brings a unique blend of experience, skills, capabilities, and relationships that make them uniquely well-equipped, particularly in terms of their relationship with the COCOM, the operational equipage of the capabilities necessary. They have a visceral appreciation of that from their experience, and then working the entire threat or kill chain associated with CWMD, all the way from ideation to consequence management. and focusing the department and the COCOMs in those areas that we have the most impact on getting at WMD.
Great. Thanks. You know, both in my capacity here and then in general, as you know, in my reserve duties, spent a lot of time focused on this issue, and just recently, within the last 6 months, there's both been kind of exercises kind of at the very large scale, you know, the Counter WMD Sync Conference, and then more tactical in nature, the Bronze Ram exercise. Do you have after actions and kind of lessons learned from those operations that are either classified or unclassified that you could share with the committee that kind of, again, so we're having good visibility on how things are developing, what you see as strengths and weaknesses?
Yes, Senator, we definitely have the after actions, and we use those to feed, you know, successive iterations. In the case of the field exercises here, we obviously adjust those in stride based on, you know, emerging threats that are out there. So probably about best that I say those here, and you know, in a closed session or afterwards, we could get the classified information to you.
Great. And then I'll just end, Madam Chair, on the North Korean threat and the network that they've developed. You know, there's a lot of us who are, you know, very curious on how much, and I've asked a lot of the intel community on this issue, but how much the North Korean proliferation network has helped with regard to not only what they're looking at in terms of proliferation, but how the advances they've made, particularly with regard to intercontinental ballistic missile testing. You know, it's hard for some of us to believe that that's all organic advancements, because they've clearly made a lot of advancements, not only on the nuclear side, but on the missile side. Do we have a sense, and again, maybe it's better for a classified session, are they getting help on the outside with regard to how quickly they're advancing? And are we confident that our networks are able to battle their networks on a country that almost certainly has a record of proliferation, but I think we would be fools if we weren't assuming that they're going to try to continue to proliferate, even with this very strong kind of sanctions net around them?
Senator, I would simply say in open session that this is something that we and the rest of the intelligence community are intensely focused upon. And that's probably all I can say here.
Okay. Well, I'm glad you're intensely focused on it. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Heinrich.
General Osterman, I wanted to ask you, obviously ISIS has lost, geographically been defeated, but would you still consider them a WMD threat even in that scenario? Because obviously this is about talent as much as anything and intellectual capacity. What's your analysis of that at this point?
Senator, my analysis is yes, they are still a threat, to put it simply. Really, when we look at pathways, we're looking at intent, infrastructure, and expertise, to your point, production, weaponization, delivery systems, and use. And they've demonstrated not only that capability over time, but even though as they lose the geographic caliphate, that those individuals that have the technical knowledge and, frankly, the level at which they were working and have been working is not one that, you know, would, by loss of that geographic caliphate, that it would undermine their ability to continue to pursue weapons of mass destruction capability.
Secretary Rapuano, one of our greatest challenges in countering particularly biological WMD is being able to, at scale, develop vaccines and other potential specialized medicines and pharmaceuticals for our troops or for populations that are impacted by those. And a good example is when Ebola began to emerge, there was a DoD vaccine that hadn't gone through the FDA full process, but there's not an obvious way to scale those up in a for-profit pharmaceutical company in many cases, and we haven't found partners to do that. Have you thought about how to address this so that we don't get caught behind the 8 ball the way that we did with the Ebola crisis?
Yes, Senator. We work very closely with HHS, BARDA over at HHS, DHS, to look at biothreats in general, including naturally occurring, to sync our research with them to ensure that we're covering the full landscape of what's naturally occurring and what perhaps could be intensified or developed for malevolent use. So we're looking at ways that we can get quick production just in time, but that's very difficult because you need that base in terms of that manufacturing base. Right. We've done that in certain areas. In other areas, it's been more challenging, but that's a priority, and that's a priority that's also reflected in the still draft but almost complete national bio-defense strategy.
I look forward to seeing that because it seems to me that, setting bioweapons aside for a moment, even with just zoonotic outbreaks, that we typically have not had the capacity to be able to manufacture things. We may know through research what would or might work, but getting that to scale in any sort of meaningful way, we don't have a mechanism to do that right now.
Yeah, absolutely.
I've got a few seconds left, and then I'll turn it over to my colleagues. Can you talk just a little bit from either of you on talking about how communities collaborate and leverage relative strengths across the counter-WMD mission in terms of how do you bring all the different talents that different agencies and labs and et cetera have together? You mentioned the Fusion Center. Like, what has worked when it comes to effectively leveraging the intellectual talent that is in different places?
So I'll take a start at that, Senator, and then hand it over to General Osterman. When you look at that spectrum of activities, all the way from intent and desire for WMD through use and response to, it is a very wide spectrum. And when we look at any one agency, including the Department of Defense, roles, responsibilities, authorities, capacity, scope, there's no one that can do it all. In fact, if you start to specialize and say what tools, techniques, weapons can be applied to getting most return on investment in terms of preventing, denying, responding. So if you start all the way to the left on the pathways, that's primarily export control driven, intel community, understanding what those pathways are. So that's very heavy Department of Commerce, Department of State. But there are still opportunities. So, for example, COCOMs are operating with partner nations. The militaries of other nations do things very differently than they do here. Some of them manage export controls. Developing an understanding of the individuals, characters, leaders, and what their level of interest is. It all forms a composite in terms of our understanding. So what SOCOM, for example, is doing with the Fusion Center is just improving that admixture, that integration of intelligence, both from a national and a military intelligence perspective. As you go further right to a point of use or threatened use or response, our activities get much more kinetic, both in terms of military operational kinetic, as well as the dynamics of a response, which really needs then to be an integrated whole-of-government response. We're very focused in the past several years on national-scale events, intentional events, nuclear events. So that obviously is a major challenge in terms of how do we achieve the unity of effort in crisis from in real time, but we are making progress in that area as well.
Very good. Senator Sullivan.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think we're doing Democrat, Republican,
Okay.
Democrat. Yeah.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I wanted to get back to, and again, if we've touched on this, I apologize, but in terms of countries, so governments, that you see as the biggest threats from the perspective of counter-WMD threats, which ones would you put in the top category?
From a strategic perspective,
Just a country that has capability and has a history of proliferation.
so obviously we need to start with the two countries who have existential WMD capability with regard to potential impact on the United States, and that's Russia and China.
But I mean, is there a history of China with regard to proliferation to bad actors, or Russia the same? Like, for example, North Korea clearly, helped Syria build a nuclear reactor, which the Israelis ended up bombing. Have we seen that kind of activity from?
When we're looking at those countries that are of greatest proliferation concern, again, depending if you're talking the dual-use commodity side of the equation, it is more mixed, but then it's not entirely always clear where those dual-use items are going, whether they're going into a WMD program potentially or a conventional program. But Iran and Syria are two very significant non-proliferation actors in terms of proliferating technologies. Iran has done it. There are a number of other countries that we have concerns and issues with that we would probably be better handling in close.
And North Korea, of course.
And North Korea, of course.
Let me ask another question related to that.
Although, just on the point of North Korea, I wouldn't say in the context of proliferating WMD per se. The dual-use piece is a lot more gray.
Well, they built the reactor in Syria. That's about as dramatic as it gets, isn't it?
So it is a concern, but really depending on how you want to draw the threshold of are they knowingly and deliberately looking to provide WMD capability to another actor, again, that's better left to a closed session.
I had once heard I'll just describe it as a senior national security official say that the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal with the United States, was had enabled us to kind of take our eye off that proliferation threat because of the fact of the agreement. That's not the current view of the U.S. military or others, is it, General?
That is not.
Mr. Secretary?
I guess it
was a shocking statement that I heard. I actually couldn't believe it, where somebody had mentioned, well, because we have the agreement now, which I was very opposed to, we don't have to look at them so much with regard to a proliferation, nuclear development problem. I think that's just incorrect, and I just wanted to get that out there to
You're
both
correct.
of you.
That is not the view of this administration.
Okay, or the U.S. military as part of the administration.
Or the U.S. military.
Let me ask one final question. With regard, we had Secretary Mattis testifying in front of the full committee yesterday on the National Defense Strategy, which I think he got a lot of bipartisan compliments on for the thoughtfulness of the document, for what its focus is. But in particular, one of the areas of focus in the document is the emphasis on our allies with regard to our national security strategy. And in this effort, the ally participation with regard to counter WMD would seem to me really important. Are we getting cooperation, and do we have regular, deep consultations with our NATO allies or other bilateral allies who have similar capabilities that we have in terms of counter WMD? Or is there more that we can do to help encourage some of these important countries to coordinate more with our counter WMD efforts?
So we have a a variety of programs. I mentioned the CTR, but a number of proliferation programs where we're developing capacity on the part of allies to operate in CBRN environments. We're assisting them in terms of understanding dual-use commodities and the potential risks. We're working with them, for example, in the maximum pressure campaign with regard to illicit shipments to North Korea, ship-to-ship transfers. So we are very active. The Secretary is very serious about partnerships being a critical element. It's from the Secretary, you've heard it from him, lethality, partnerships, and reform. And that partnership component of our WMD approach is a mainstay.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Here. So I wanted to follow up on that a little bit because I understand that we're a participant under the Proliferation Security Initiative, and that that works with our international partners to interdict shipments of WMD-related items. Can you talk about that a little more than you just did with Senator Sullivan, and also talk about its importance in addressing situations like North Korea in terms of the potential to interdict shipments of nuclear-related materials?
Yes, Senator. The Proliferation Security Initiative is not an operational coordination process. It's really about developing a common understanding and prioritization of proliferation consequences and impacts and working together. What flows from that oftentimes are operational coordination. For example, the hail and queries of ships at sea. But that's not done within PSI per se. It's more about having that worldwide cooperation, discussing and agreeing conceptually, but actual operational coordination happens bilaterally in small groups, and another topic that would be best addressed in a closed hearing.
So with respect to its importance in addressing the situation in North Korea, can you speak to that in this open session?
Well, simply to say that we have a growing number of partners and allies who are looking to cooperate with us on addressing illicit shipments, including ship-to-ship.
And does that include states like Russia and China?
Well, I just wouldn't go into detail in this session talking about individual relationships and agreements that at this point.
General Osterman, as you have both pointed out, we have a multitude of threats of WMD around the world. Can you talk about how our military assesses the severity of each threat and the potential resources that it would require to respond?
Yes, Senator. There's I kind of described that pathway framework earlier. Most of the assessments are addressed in our functional campaign planning. And so in other words, we look at it from a wide variety of criteria, from their, what is their intent to what is their ability, all the way through that. And then really from a trans-regional perspective, some of that threat is, how are they looking to work this in a trans-regional fashion? Are they exporting? Is it, a singular small node? Is it, what are the viability of chemicals that they may be capable of producing, for example, or, as was mentioned earlier, the biological agent aspect of things, et cetera. So that's basically how we get into the assessments of that risk. And really what we do is we define that prioritization, if you will, of threats, and then, as I mentioned, matrix that with the actors that are out there to kind of come up with recommendations up through the department about how do we prioritize and how do we set policy, for those. But that's really about it. Most of that's based on our intelligence and our technical means of looking at things. And we translate that internally just to make sure that we have the response and protective force capability within the military to operate in that environment and or, counter the particular WMD we may be working with.
And you were talking, Senator Heinrich earlier raised the question of ISIS and whether they continue to have the capacity to inflict major damage through WMD. You talked about and we've all read about the reduction of their caliphate and that they're on the run. There have been several news reports recently that have talked about the fact that there are significant numbers of ISIS fighters who have gone underground and are reappearing in other places and have the potential to reorganize. And since we saw that in Syria, and that's how ISIS reconstituted itself from al-Qaeda, what are we doing about that, and how much of a concern is that?
Senator, what we're doing with that is that even though the writ large ISIS has a number of people that are basically moving to counterinsurgency or to an insurgency type of mode or whatever, the actual number of individuals that are associated with WMD production, and this goes back to your definitional question about what is WMD, the ability to put low toxicity into something, is that really WMD? So it's a very, very finite technical capability and human capital issue. So it's, and they are generally not frontline fighters. They're folks that were not necessarily easy to track, but they're ones that we've been working on for a number of years here and have ideas where they are, if we haven't already basically taking them off the battle space. So that's where my concern is, and where we watch very closely, again, through the trans-regional approach, is to make sure that they're not leaving that area of operations and perhaps then becoming an export, or as we term it, an ex-ops threat to the United States proper.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
I believe we have time for one more brief round of questions. So if we can just maybe ask one final question in this last round, and then we'll wrap up our subcommittee hearing. And I appreciate, Mr. Secretary, the discussion about the different agencies that you interact with, whether it's Department of Energy, Homeland Security, other entities. Being the junior senator from the great state of Iowa, one agency that I did not hear was the USDA. And one thing that we don't often discuss is the fact that, yes, we want to protect our human capital, but part of that is also protecting our feedstocks here in the United States. And we have had an active discussion in the Ag Committee about offshore vaccine banks for things like foot and mouth disease that would impact agriculture at large with livestock, other diseases that could be introduced into plant varieties of agriculture. What are the discussions when it comes to working with the USDA and protecting agriculture?
Thank you very much, Senator. That was a major omission on my part. Agriculture is the lead federal agency for threats to agriculture, livestock, and they play a very important role because that is a critical commodity in terms of our economy and our population's needs. Mm-hmm. So they are part of that team and a core member of that team, helping evaluate potential threats to agriculture and developing approaches either to forestall or respond to events that threaten U.S. ag.
Okay, I appreciate that. Thank you very much. And Senator Heinrich.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Secretary Rapuano, you mentioned the draft National Biodefense Strategy that was actually required back in the FY 2017 NDAA, and a number of members of this committee, including the chair and the ranking member of the full committee, have been sort of waiting with bated breath for that. What is the holdup, and when will we see that document, do you think?
So that is at the White House. We've been participating in the NSC and DHS-led review of the biostrategy. I met with the director on the NSC staff 2 weeks ago on that topic. To my understanding, it is just about there, but okay. I don't have the latest, and I'm not. And
the reason being, we're hoping to use that for the FY 2019 NDAA. So
absolutely,
the sooner the better.
Understood.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And gentlemen, I just want to ask one final question on, interagency cooperation, which I'm sure I think we all would agree is really essential to defeating the networks that you're, the proliferation networks that you're focused on. Do you see that there is, in terms of this mission, sufficient cooperation between, say, the intel community, DOD, SOCOM, Department of Energy, Department of Ag, and others, or are there statutory improvements that we could help you with that could help make sure that the mission and the interagency coordination is not stovepiped and it brings together all the agencies?
So, Senator, I don't see any statutory obstacles, and in my experience, the interagency community working CWMD is very collaborative, works very well together. We are constantly looking for ways we can improve the process and focus and prioritize those threats that are most extant to us. Also looking ahead at evolving technology and actors to better understand where the most significant threats will come from. That's part of the great work that SOCOM is doing in their new coordinating authority role for the COCOM. So I would, just speaking for myself, from my perspective, say that we're on the right road, but we definitely have room to improve, and we're moving out.
Senator, if I could add on to that, with all the different functional areas and different units and everything else I've worked with in the military, to be honest with you, entering the counter WMD realm here, I've never found a community that works more closely together. It's literally an open door everywhere you go, from not only an interagency, but also an IC perspective, and then also from an allied perspective. So some of those tangible examples are routinely meeting with the various intel agencies affiliated with this and their sub-organizations, collaboratively working on tools and intel assessments, as well as no kidding, tangible technical means on certain things. From an allied perspective, that question earlier, we actually bring in allied partners to our twice-a-year Global Sync conference that come in there to participate and sit in as participating members. So it really is, in my view, a tremendous community, and frankly, just having forums to bring them together, which is a big responsibility on SOCOM as a coordinating authority, to be able to convene those meetings, bring everyone together, and then get concerted effort in a particular direction based on departmental guidance has actually, that hasn't been the problem. You know, it's everybody's willing to help. It's just trying to getting everything moving in the same direction, and very, very positive responses so far.
Great.
Well, thank you. I'd like to thank my colleagues and Senator Heinrich for coordinating this meeting for us today as well. Secretary and General, thank you for your wonderful expertise and your commitment to the men and women of our uniformed services, as well as our civilian population, citizens of the great United States, for all that you do. We look forward to seeing how SOCOM progresses during this transition, and we look forward to working with you on any initiatives that you deem necessary. So thank you very much for joining us today, and we will conclude this subcommittee meeting. I'm wondering if I should wander out there or not.
Absolutely. Yes, ma'am. That was great.
Well, good. Be good to get together.
Thank you. Hey there. How are you? Good to see you. You're not kidding up.
Okay, thank you.
It was good. That would be good. Thanks for having me. Okay, good to see you. We were like,
Oh, really?
yeah, so that's the gist of it. Yeah.
What kind of question is that? Thrill a million. Oh, really? Yeah. Oh, we did so much value. The Fed. We had some of the Air Force that I worked with in the 90s. They had to graduate. Yeah. So the mission models basically is a free graduate work. Super